All right, so now we're going to kind of pick up where we left off with the last video, talking about what the United States looks like after World War II. So we talked about all the things that were going on. Well, also, we're going to see in the late 1940s, 1950s, and 60s, political actions and decisions resolved thorny issues that Americans had faced for many decades. Now, that being individual rights, okay, civil rights and social welfare were addressed by Americans. We talked about with the EPA, with Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., with Betty Freeman and the NOW organization. However, this is very important. We saw laws passed as a result of it, with the Civil Rights Act and the Voting Rights Act. Those are the legislative branch. We saw executive orders issued by President Truman when it came to the integration of the armed forces and the creation of Earth Day and whatnot. Well, sometimes we're actually going to see, and this is big because this is, the Supreme Court's been in the news lately. It's important to understand that it was also put by private citizens. Now, also during most of the 1950s and 60s, the U.S. Supreme Court was headed by a guy of Chief Justice Earl Warren. Because he was the head of Supreme Court, it became, like with quotations, the Warren Court. Now, the court, we saw, issued a number of landmark decisions. One being, of course, the Brown versus Board of Education being a major landmark decision. So it's important to identify that the Supreme Court is going to take a stance because, again, they ruled in Brown versus Board of Education that segregation laws, Jim Crow laws, were unconstitutional. So now, in 1963, there was also another important ruling which talks about kind of the rights of the accused, and that being in the Miranda v. Arizona. As we can see over here in this cartoon, how the court case pretty much goes, it says, the girl you kidnapped and raped has been identified you. I guess you've got me. And he's sitting down and he's, yes, I'll sign this. This confession says you signed it voluntarily. Yeah. Well, he is found guilty. However, it goes to the Supreme Court. Okay. And it says Miranda signed the confession voluntarily. And this is the argument. However, the people on the other side say Miranda didn't get to speak to an attorney before being questioned. He didn't know that he had the right to remain silent. So the question was raised, how do we balance the rights of the accused with the ability of the police to arrest criminal and bring them to justice? And so what we have here, guys, is this, as a result of this ruling, they came out and said the ruling established the Miranda rights, or made it where police had to read suspected criminals their rights before being arrested. So you have the right to remain silent. Anything you say can and will be used against you in a court of law. You have the right to attorney. If you cannot provide one will be provided for you. Do you understand these rights that are being read to you? The reason cops have to read that is because of this court case. Now, so it's important because the Miranda decision strengthened Americans' individual rights. Now, other key decisions of the Warren Court, and here we go, because this is what they do, upheld the constitutionality of the Civil Rights Act of 64 and the Voting Rights Act of 1965. Overturned state laws that were discriminatory, such as racial intermarriage laws. Yes, it was illegal in states for people of different races to marry. And so they declared those unconstitutional under the Warren Court as well. Now, we have President Lyndon B. Johnson. When he becomes president, we're looking at internally kind of what's going on in the United States. He is going to launch something known as his Great Society. He wants to make society great, and this is his domestic policy. Now you're going to come to find out Johnson, again, he's got to deal with the Cold War, but this is something to identify with Lyndon B. Johnson as well. And what he called his Great Society was a program as a way of attacking the epidemic problem of poverty in the United States. And he believed the post-war prosperity of the United States could be used to solve key quality of life issues. So What he did is Johnson's programs evolved around these kind of things. First, he issued a war on poverty. Now, his war on poverty within his Great Society was about 40 programs that was intended to eliminate poverty by improving living conditions and enabling people to end the cycle of poverty. So he wanted to give out resources. Now, we don't have to specifically know the legislation for all of those, just identified as a cluster of programs, meaning a group of programs. Now, next, guaranteed health care for every American over 65. That would be Medicare. Medicare was a part of the Great Society, and then of course provided health care assistance to the poor and those pretty much under the age of 18 if needed. That being Medicaid. All right, you have to be identified, and these are still around today. All right, the Medicare and Medicaid. Now, we also need to associate the Civil Rights Act of 64 and the Voting Rights Act of 65 has also been tied to, of course, the Great Society. As a result, the Great Society has been defined as an attempt to eliminate poverty and racial injustice in the United States. So, goal to end poverty, but again, he wanted to make this Great Society. He includes the Civil Rights Act and the Voting Rights Act, and this, of course, is creating a better society in America. Historians, this is big idea because we're looking at comparison, have also compared the Great Society to the New Deal. In both programs, we see changing, here we go, the role of the federal government. Why? Because of instead of the government taking a hands-off approach and allowing citizens to kind of take care of it, we begin to see citizens dependent on the government aid. All right, and this is where we begin to see steps of what was identified as a welfare state. Now, there's also a major year that's going to go on, and that being 1968. So the cultural and political landscape of the 60s seemed to come to a head in 1968. You have the anti-war movement. You have rebellion of the youth and tensions going like crazy. Now, you're also going to have the assassination, of course, of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. and a presidential candidate known as Robert Kennedy. Robert Kennedy was John F. Kennedy's little brother. Now, this led to rioting and were symbolic of the turmoil that was faced in the United States. The Tet Offensive also increased tensions over the war. Now, we'll kind of describe the Tet Offensive when you read about it during the Cold War guided reading. This was because, here we go, when we look at the Vietnam conflict, remember, Vietnam conflict was the first war fought in people's living rooms because of the TV. Now, this was because it contradicted. So people saw what the Tet Offensive was. They saw Vietnam fighting like crazy. So that contradicted the positive picture that Johnson's administration had been painting in the media. So pretty much what happened is Johnson was saying we were winning the war, but what's shown on TV doesn't look anything close to like it. So by August, tensions reached a boiling point at the Democratic National Convention, which became remembered as a scene where police armed with clubs and tear gas violently beat anti-war protesters live on TV. This event set the foundation for the election of a more conservative president, Richard Nixon. Also, in 1968, the first Black Power demonstrations were held at Howard University. This marked the beginning of an increased disappointment. This movement, because we know the Black Power movement began to kind of use a little bit more violent protest because people are becoming upset with the nonviolent and still didn't think it was moving fast enough. So that is the kind of cultural landscape of the post-World War II United States. Always remember to smile because, of course, it is contagious.